Imagine the Macedonian phalanx in battle. It was more than just a formation. It was a living wall of steel and wood, a slow-moving press designed to crush infantry. 5 ranks of spears, or sarissas, nearly 20 feet long, were thrust forward, sweeping aside everything in their path. This system was perfected by Philip II, who crushed the Greeks at Chaeronea in 338 BCE. His son, Alexander, then used it to conquer the Persian Empire. For 150 years, the phalanx was considered the absolute pinnacle of military thought. How, then, was this seemingly flawless machine systematically dismantled? After Alexander's death, his empire fragmented. However, his generals inherited the most crucial assets, the army and its tactics. By the early 2nd century BCE, Hellenistic kingdoms, from Macedon to Ptolemaic Egypt, relied on the phalanx as a symbol of their power. Their wars often resembled mirror battles, with one phalanx engaging another, almost identical formation. This created a tactical stalemate. Meanwhile, on the Apennine Peninsula, a different civilization was gaining strength. The Roman Republic was forged through hundreds of years of continuous warfare. Its army, the legion, was a product of harsh evolution, not a brilliant design. It was in the mountains of Italy, during the brutal Samnite Wars, that the Romans recognized the futility of their old phalanx and developed a flexible manipular system. Their army was born not from theory, but from the bloody lessons of the battlefield. Now these two forces were destined to meet. To understand the outcome of this duel, we must dissect both mechanisms, starting with the Macedonian phalanx. Its secret lay in its monolithic power. Imagine 16 ranks of soldiers deep. The first 5 ranks held their sarissas horizontally, creating a deadly, bristling wall of spearheads at the front that no enemy could penetrate. But the most crucial aspect occurred in the rear. The back ranks didn't merely hold their spears at an angle, protecting the formation from arrows. They braced their sarissas against the backs of their comrades in front, generating immense physical pressure. This transformed the phalanx into a single battering ram, a human glacier, where the will of individual soldiers was subsumed by the collective, relentless forward movement. The sight of an approaching phalanx was, in itself, a weapon. The measured tread of thousands of soldiers, the swaying forest of spears, and the glint of steel broke enemy morale even before battle began. It was a spectacle of absolute power, comparable only to the sight of a 20th century tank armada. The ancient historian Polybius, an eyewitness to these events, wrote, "It is impossible to imagine a more terrifying or awe-inspiring sight. It was a parade of inevitable death." However, this power came at a cost. The phalanx was effective only on perfectly flat terrain. Any hill, ravine, or even a scattering of rocks could disrupt its formation, creating dangerous gaps in the monolithic wall. It was like a single, strong bone, incredibly resilient under direct pressure, but brittle if twisted or broken. The slightest crack, caused by uneven ground, could lead to a catastrophic fracture of the entire line. Its main vulnerability stemmed directly from its primary advantage. By concentrating all its power in a frontal assault, the phalanx was almost defenseless from the flanks and rear. Holding a 20-foot sarissa required both hands, rendering the small shield, which hung from the neck, almost useless. If an enemy penetrated beyond the wall of spears, a phalangite instantly transformed from predator to prey, unable to defend himself or attack in close combat. By the time it clashed with Rome, the phalanx had become frozen in time. Hellenistic kings viewed it as the perfect weapon and made no attempts to evolve it. They sought flat fields for battles, adapting reality to fit their tactics rather than the other way around. This was a classic trap of success. The system that had brought Alexander an empire was canonized. His successors prepared their armies for the wars of the past, failing to notice the emergence of an entirely new adversary. In contrast to the monolithic Phalanx, the legion was a modular system. Its primary unit was not a vast line, but a maneuverable menipule of 120 men. The legion was formed in 3 lines: hastati, principes, and triarii, arranged in a checkerboard pattern. This structure was ingenious in its simplicity. It allowed lines to relieve each other in battle, permitted skirmishers to retreat through the ranks, or enabled gaps to be plugged. If the Phalanx was a battering ram, the legion was a piston. It could breathe in, allowing tired soldiers to fall back, and then breathe out, pushing fresh forces forward. It's no coincidence that the saying, "It came down to the triarii," emerged in Rome, signifying a desperate situation where the last reserve of hardened veterans had to be committed to battle. The Roman legionary was the complete antithesis of the Phalanx soldier. He was a versatile fighter. First, he would hurl 2 heavy javelins called pila, designed to pierce enemy shields and disrupt their ranks. The genius of the pilum lay in its construction. A long, thin iron shank behind a wooden shaft would bend upon impact with a shield. This rendered the shield useless and prevented the enemy from pulling out the javelin to throw it back. After this, the legionary would engage in close combat, protected by his large scutum shield and delivering short, deadly thrusts with his gladius sword. He was not a cog in a machine, but an individual predator. Key to this flexibility was the command system. At the head of each manipule stood centurions, battle-hardened professionals, often promoted from the ranks. Unlike the aristocrats leading the Phalanx, a centurion made decisions on the spot, in the thick of combat. He knew his men and could exploit any opportunity without waiting for orders from above. While a Macedonian general moved massive, unwieldy blocks across the field, the centurion won the battle in the dirt and blood on his own section of the front. The Romans never considered their system perfect. They ruthlessly learned from their enemies. They adopted the gladius from the Spanish and chainmail from the Gauls. During the First Punic War, lacking a navy, they invented the corvus boarding bridge, transforming naval battles into land engagements, where their infantry held the advantage. The legion was not a static dogma, but a living, constantly evolving organism. Thus, 2 philosophies of war were set to clash on the battlefield. The Macedonian approach sought ideal conditions for employing a perfect but fragile instrument. The Roman approach involved using an adaptive tool capable of prevailing in any circumstances, even the most chaotic. It was a duel between a surgeon's scalpel and a Swiss army knife. The first practical test of these 2 philosophies occurred in 197 BCE. During the Second Macedonian War, the army of Titus Quinctius Flamininus and the forces of King Philip V stumbled upon each other by chance in Thessaly. A thick morning fog obscured the combatants. No one had planned a decisive battle here. The place bore the prophetic name Cynoscephalae, meaning dogs' heads, due to the peculiar shape of its hills. This was terrain designed to break orderly formations. The geography itself that day was on Rome's side. The battle began with a chaotic skirmish of vanguards in the hills. Philip, seeing the initial success of his men, made a daring and risky decision. to deploy the Phalanx directly on the uneven terrain. His right wing, having formed up, began its slow, relentless descent, pushing the Romans down the slope, even here, on rough ground. The monolithic wall of spears proved its terrifying effectiveness. Polybius wrote that the Romans could not withstand the density and bristling power of this formation. The legion's left flank began to buckle. It seemed that Philip's genius was about to snatch victory against all odds. However, Philip's left wing was delayed on the march. Soldiers were still arriving on the battlefield in marching columns and tried to deploy into battle formation in complete disarray, directly under attack. This was akin to attempting to assemble a complex mechanism in the middle of a firefight. A fatal gap opened between the two halves of the Macedonian army. Flamininus immediately hurled his war elephants at this disorganized flank, turning chaos into a panicked rout. And here, Rome's chief advantage became apparent. While Flamininus was crushing the Macedonian left wing, on the other flank, which was retreating under the pressure of the successful Phalanx, an unnamed military tribune displayed incredible initiative. He saw that the rear of the victorious Macedonian right wing was completely exposed and defenseless. Without waiting for orders, he turned his 20 manipules, approximately 2,000 men, and struck the Phalanx in the back. History hasn't even preserved his name. This was a victory not of an individual genius, but of the entire Roman system, which cultivated and encouraged such commanders. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. Legionaries with their short swords surged into the defenseless rear ranks. Phalangites, encumbered by their 20-foot sarissas, could neither turn nor fight. A slaughter ensued. The impregnable wall of spears disintegrated from within. In desperation, the surrounded Macedonians raised their sarissas vertically. This was their traditional sign of surrender. But the Romans, unfamiliar with this custom, or simply overcome by the fury of battle, continued to kill. Cynoscephalae became the first hammer blow, demonstrating that flexible tactics and individual initiative could breach any, even the strongest, wall. But the lesson of Cynoscephalae was not learned by all. Nearly 30 years later, Philip's son, King Perseus, decided to prove that his father had simply chosen the wrong battlefield. He assembled a magnificent army, and for the decisive Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, selected precisely what the Macedonians had lacked before, a perfectly flat field. This was a deliberate duel between two systems, a final attempt to demonstrate the superiority of the Macedonian war machine. Opposing Perseus was the experienced and methodical Roman consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The Phalanx advanced, and its onslaught was terrifying. The legions could not withstand this living wall of spears and began to slowly retreat. Lucius Aemilius Paulus himself, a veteran of countless campaigns, later recalled that the sight of the advancing Phalanx was the most dreadful spectacle of his life. Plutarch writes that the consul was paralyzed with terror upon seeing this wall of shields and bristling sea of steel. At that moment, it seemed that dogma was about to triumph, and flexibility would lose to brute force. But Aemilius Paulus did not succumb to panic. He understood that confronting this juggernaut head-on was futile. He issued one of the most challenging orders to execute, not to flee, but to retreat in an organized manner towards the foothills. This was a brilliant stratagem. Drawn into pursuit, the Phalanx was forced to quicken its pace. Its perfect formation, moving over increasingly uneven ground, inevitably began to stretch. Small cracks and gaps started appearing in the monolithic wall. Paulus forced the very strength of the phalanx to work against it, turning its pursuit into self-destruction. He waited for this precise moment. The consul ordered his manipules and cohorts not to attack in a single front, but to operate in wedges, infiltrating the slightest gaps. The legionaries acted like a pack of wolves attacking a massive but unwieldy bear. They didn't strike its hide. Instead, they burst into unprotected areas, tearing the beast apart from within. As soon as a Roman found himself behind the wall of spears, the battle devolved into thousands of deadly duels, and in that tight, brutal melee, the short gladius was incomparably more effective than the cumbersome sarissa. The climax arrived with astonishing speed. In less than an hour, the Macedonian army was virtually annihilated. The Battle of Pydna became a death sentence not only for the Phalanx, but also for the entire Macedonian kingdom, which soon became a Roman province. 4 centuries of history, initiated by Philip II, ended on that field. A perfect system, when confronted by an adversary who had learned to systematically exploit its flaws, suffered a final and crushing defeat. It marked the end of an entire military era. So, why did the Legion win? If we boil this duel down to its fundamentals, it all starts with equipment. The Roman pilum was designed to break formations, and the gladius to kill in close quarters. A phalangite was effective only as part of a wall. Once that wall crumbled, he became almost defenseless. A legionary, however, was a versatile soldier, prepared for any scenario. One could say that the phalangite's gear was 100% optimized for working in formation. The legionary's gear was 70% optimized for formation and 30% for surviving chaos. And it was that 30% that decided the outcome of the war. Secondly, it was a battle of tactical formations. The phalanx was a rigid line, the legion a flexible grid. Gaps in the legion's formation were part of its tactics, allowing the second line to engage. Gaps in the phalanx were fatal, as they exposed its defenseless flanks to enemy penetration. The phalanx was designed for order. The legion was designed to create chaos and thrive within it. The Romans weren't just winning the battle, they were changing its rules so that the Macedonians could no longer play. Thirdly, it was a clash of command philosophies. The Macedonian king managed his army as a single, unwieldy mechanism. The Roman consul issued general directives, but the outcome of the battle was decided by centurions and tribunes on the ground. The Roman army possessed tactical intelligence at all levels. To use a modern analogy, the Macedonian army was a hierarchical corporation with micromanagement from the CEO. The Roman army was built on principles of delegation, where middle managers had the authority to take initiative to achieve the overall objective. This was a victory for a more sophisticated management structure. Ultimately, Rome won because its military system was built on the principle of adaptability. The Macedonians sought ideal conditions for their perfect weapon. The Romans created a weapon effective in any conditions. They didn't search for a convenient battlefield, they made any battlefield convenient for themselves. The Romans didn't try to break the phalanx head-on. They methodically destabilized it, forced it to move across difficult terrain, provoked the appearance of gaps, and then poured into these breaches, destroying the system from within. They turned the phalanx's main advantage, its monolithic nature, into its primary weakness. Essentially, the Romans hacked the phalanx's operating system. they found its fundamental vulnerability, its reliance on the integrity of its formation, and wrote a virus, an infiltration tactic, that caused a fatal system crash. This story is more than just a military analysis. It is an enduring parable about two different approaches to problem solving. The Phalanx was an ideal but highly specialized tool that collapsed when conditions changed. The Legion was a flexible, modular system, ready for any challenge. Rome's victory became a triumph of pragmatism over dogma. To use an analogy from the natural world, the Phalanx resembled a saber-toothed tiger, a perfect predator for its environment, but one that became extinct when that environment changed. The Legion, however, was like a wolf, a versatile hunter, capable of surviving and dominating in any landscape. Having defeated the Phalanx, the Legion became the dominant military force in the Mediterranean for the next 400 years. It was the Legion that allowed Rome to build an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. The flexibility and discipline honed in battles with Macedon became the foundation of this colossal edifice. The Legion was not merely an army, but an instrument of civilization. Veterans receiving land in conquered provinces carried with them the Latin language, Roman laws, and culture. Thus, a tactical victory on the battlefield transformed into a civilizational one, shaping the face of Europe. This lesson remains relevant today. We see it in business, where cumbersome corporations with rigid hierarchies lose to agile startups. We observe it in technology, where closed systems give way to open platforms. Recall Blockbuster, whose ideal but inflexible video rental network was destroyed by Netflix's adaptive model. Or Nokia, which dogmatically believed in its button-operated phones, swept away by the open ecosystem of smartphones. Ultimately, this is an eternal duel between tradition and innovation. The Macedonian Phalanx was the apex of one military paradigm, but the Roman Legion created an entirely new one. This prompts us to consider what perfect systems that we believe in today will prove fragile in the face of the future. History shows that the ability to adapt is the highest form of strength. As the principle often attributed to Darwin states, it is not the strongest that survive, but those who best adapt to change. And the battle between the Legion and the Phalanx is a military testament to this biological law.